Britain's been left isolated as the rest of Europe sets a timetable for economic unity. Mrs. Thatcher tells the other summit leaders they're in cloud cuckoo land. And Moscow's latest peace initiative in the Gulf ends in failure. Good evening. 11 of the 12 leaders of the European community agreed at their summit in Rome today on a timetable that would lead to a single currency by the year 2000. Only Mrs. Thatcher opposed it, but she was left on the sidelines, protesting that the other leaders were living in cloud cuckoo land. Despite her opposition, the summit agreed to the so-called Stage 2 of the plan for economic and monetary union, the establishment of a European central bank by January 1994.
The European leaders have turned their back on Britain and its arguments. President Mitterrand said, "We cannot slow down to the pace of those who want to stay outside." They gathered this morning, making no attempt to portray unity. Instead, 11 of the 12 pledged themselves to a single common currency, the ECU, and an independent European bank to run it. They prepared a communiqué setting out their common position. Mrs. Thatcher was allowed to summarize her objections, but was otherwise ignored. In 1994, the 11 say they will enter a new stage of monetary union. By 1997, they will review progress and then establish the new currency within a reasonable time. By the year 2000, Europe could well be using the ecu instead of the mark, the franc and the lira. But Mrs. Thatcher will defend the pound.
I would not accept to have the community saying we must abolish the pound sterling. We will not have that imposed upon us. I don't know what a parliament in 40, 50 years' time will say. What I do know now is I'm not prepared to go to parliament and suggest we abolish the pound sterling, and if I were, it would not get through. I think the most obvious practical expression of your sovereignty is your currency. Your currency, your coin and your notes, and your capacity to uphold that currency by your monetary and economic policy. And we're prepared to have a common currency. We're not prepared to have a single currency imposed upon us.
The Italians have chaired the Rome meeting, intending it to be a milestone in community history. Mrs. Thatcher may say the economic principles are unworkable and the political suggestions a rag bag, but the Italians won't quarrel. They say it'll be for the British to decide when to catch up with the rest.
It is quite clear that Great Britain and the British government has to take into account that there is a full agreement between 11 member states. And so that's important. I do know that the conference can end only with a unanimity decision, but at the same time, the European public opinion and the British public opinion must know very well that on some important objectives there is a full agreement among 11 member states.
The British say that radical change requires unanimous consent, and they haven't given it. They'll be back here in December for another summit, ready to argue their case. But it's to be questioned how much Mrs. Thatcher's voice will count in a community which has already isolated her. Brian Hanraha-hanrahan, BBC News, Rome.
The President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, said today there will be a single currency before the year 2000. But British officials think many practical difficulties lie ahead.
Mrs. Thatcher believes that when her European partners start to discuss the details of what's been agreed today, they'll find it more difficult to make progress than they expect. Stage 1 of the Delors plan for monetary union requires all member states to join the exchange rate mechanism. Portugal and Greece have yet to go in, and Britain only joined 3 weeks ago. That leaves a lot to be done to meet the new 1994 deadline. The Bundesbank